Welcome to our Voices of Africa podcast, brought to you by Africa Practice, a strategic advisory firm supplying insights and advocacy solutions to corporations, investors, governments, and foundations in Africa. In a world with complex and interdependent challenges, we take the guesswork out of business engagement. We enable our clients to see more clearly in order to drive sustainable and equitable development.
Hello and welcome to Voices of Africa. My name is Marcus Courage and I'm the CEO of Africa Practice. And it's my pleasure to interview some of Africa's leading change makers. Today you're in for a treat because we have none other than Wangeci Kanjama. She's the Group CFO of SPIRO, an e-mobility solutions company. And we're going to be speaking about all things to do with electric vehicles on the continent. E-mobility, as we know, is a growing sector, represents exciting opportunities for personal mobility, particularly in urban areas, but also in the race to decarbonize our planet. Wangeci, it's a thrill to be speaking with you today. Hello.
Hello, and thank you so much for having me.
So, Wangeci, I have been looking forward to this. I was recollecting and preparing that last time we met, you were not with SPIRO. I think you've only been there under a year. You were with M-Pesa. And prior to that, I know you were with Safaricom. I wonder, rather than me introduce you and your biography, tell us about your career, the choices that you've made, and what lured you to join SPIRO.
Thank you so much. So my career journey has been one of an adventure. I really do like working and I welcome new opportunities to learn. I started working very early in my teens. As I reflected, I realized that my parents introduced me to business early because they were both entrepreneurs and they liked the idea of having more control over their destiny and their time. But what it did for us as children is that we started working in the family businesses fairly early in life. So my career choices have always been a little contrarian in the sense that I'm an accountant by training, but the choices that I have made regarding my career haven't necessarily come from my accounting training, but they've come from me learning on the job, really taking an interest in a field that maybe doesn't look well understood, that doesn't look mainstream at the time that I joined, but with time begins to attract talent as well. So when I look back at my journey, the longest part of my career was spent within the telecommunication industry. Towards the end of my time at Safaricom, I then moved to the fintech side of the business. We started what became the M-Pesa Africa business, and that whole framework was to ensure that M-Pesa does become a center of excellence and that we can harness the synergy and the potential of it for our markets. Now, as I walked through that journey and I began to yearn for my next opportunity, I realized that I wanted a new challenge, and I tend to read quite widely. And one of the things that I began to see was that renewable energy, e-mobility are beginning to pick pace across the various continents and will be coming to Africa. I therefore was very intentional as I did my research and said, should an opportunity like that come up, I would welcome the chance just to be part of that journey. And that is how then I entered into SPIRO, which is an e-mobility provider that has come onto the African continent. We are currently now in 5 African countries and growing. And it has been a very, very interesting 6 months. I've learned immensely. I've begun to understand the terminology of the industry much better, the essence of the role of the battery and power. The understanding the customer also that we're serving has become quite pivotal for me. And if there's one thing that has really anchored my journey as a professional, it has always been learn. And this is something that I got from my mother. She reads quite widely. And even now, as she approaches 80, she's quite an avid reader. So there's nothing that she doesn't read. And picking from her philosophy, what I've done is made sure that I can learn things. I don't necessarily need to be taught, but I just take an interest. I take the simplest form of the book and I just begin to read it. We have a lot of information now on the internet. And so it's as a result of that reading that I've been able to make these career changes and still add value, because then the minute I begin to understand something, I begin to bring my contribution. So learning things that don't add value has also been very important for me, because you also have to learn from your mistakes. You have to learn, pick the lessons, be resilient and keep moving. So those are the things that have anchored my journey. And if I finish that reflection, what I would say is, for me, what I've picked is attitude really does determine altitude. If you really are determined to learn, to grow, to make a difference, it is painful at times. Sometimes it does take you out of your comfort zone, but you will, in the end, grow and become a better person for having done so.
Oh, well, it's lovely to hear that story, Wangeci. I've had the benefit of observing your career trajectory in some proximity. And when I saw your move to SPIRO, I genuinely was excited. I know you've only been with SPIRO for 6 months now, but tell us about the landscape and why it presents such exciting opportunities for companies like SPIRO.
When I began to do my research about the challenges of transportation in Africa, it really hit me that what we typically refer to as the border rider really does struggle to make ends meet. And therefore, when they carry passengers, first of all, they're exposed to a lot of injuries. They travel quite fast. There's the need to do more trips. So the journey in itself sometimes is not always safe. The cost of petrol is very high. And just the mechanics of sustaining that business based on what they take home is very, very low. So if you look within the East African region, for example, even if you go into the West African region, you will find increasingly two-wheelers are becoming very popular modes of transport. If it wasn't for the two-wheelers, what then would be happening is a lot more people would be walking, and it would take them quite a considerable time to get to their places of work. So it is with that consideration that you come in and you ask yourself, how could we as businesses who are entering into this e-mobility space make a difference? We definitely can make a difference, one, by working with the governments of the countries in which we are in, by being very open to partnership and collaboration, because it's not the kind of journey that you take on your own. There are also concerns around just the cost of doing e-mobility business in Africa. But once you are very pragmatic regarding your time horizon, because this is not the kind of business that you master in a year, it does take time to grow. And as the ecosystem then comes together, the opportunity then begins to unfold for many more people, for the users of the service and also the businesses themselves.
Thanks. I want to talk about those partnerships you referred to, if I may. One of the hallmarks of the success of the M-Pesa business model was the One M-Pesa ecosystem with merchants, developers, consumers. Tell us a little bit more about the sort of ecosystem model that you are developing with SPIRO and the partnerships that you're evolving to make that work.
As I've worked more in business, I began to realize, especially post-COVID, how important partnerships really are. So when you look at the EV space, there are different capabilities that are needed so that the ecosystem begins to scale. One, the product itself is a bit costly for the rider. So you need a framework where, partnering with asset financiers, you are able to provide the product in a much more affordable manner. So asset financiers become very critical, and we at SPIRO have made a point of partnering with quite a number. We've partnered with Mogo, we've partnered with Watu, and we continue to look for other players. We've partnered with Jali. Some of these players are actually local players, some of them are regional players, and we're looking increasingly to position ourselves to be very open to asset financing partnerships for the bikes and batteries, because it will make the product affordable and more reachable. Secondly, the other important element that is very key is just the power element. Power in Africa is very necessary, but can sometimes not be very stable, or when it is available, it is a bit costly. So we are looking there just to understand how we partner with players who are able to provide power. And when we talk about power within an EV context, we are obviously talking about renewable sources of power. So we're looking to partner with players who can really help us with solar power as an alternative to hydropower. Solar power now is not as expensive as it used to be 10, 15 years ago in Africa. There are many more players who are able to provide mini grids of solar power. So that is going to become a critical focus for us in terms of just partnerships. Then the other area for us, which is also very, very important, is just being able to partner with distributors. These distributors are, whether you want to call them wholesalers, whether you want to call them dealers, whether you want to call them agents, are going to help us increasingly widen our footprint across the African continent, because it's not our aim necessarily to be, in every country set up on a very large scale, but working through partnerships, we can quickly find that we are present in a number of markets and with people who really understand the dynamics of what happens in those particular markets. Then we will move from, experimenting to actually working based on the synergies and the strengths of the partners on the ground. So those are the broad-based areas, but it doesn't limit us because our business also has a tech element to it. And when we look at the tech stack of our business, that tech stack is about monetizing the data that we get from all the bikes that we are tracking and how the batteries are in use. And therefore, of that data monetization, there are opportunities to offer other types of solutions, whether they be financial solutions, whether they be products for businesses that they can use off our solutions. That is also an area that we're going to continue to explore and welcome partnerships as well.
That's fascinating. Wangeci, can you elaborate on that last point around offering finance for products to businesses in the broader value chain?
So one of the things that is clear is that we track our bikes. Why do we track them? Because to the point I raised earlier around asset financing, we need to know where the bike is. We need to track the bike. We also track the bike because the bike is in use with the battery. So when the rider is procuring our product, what they really buy is the bike. The battery remains our property. And the reason why that happens is that the health of the battery is of paramount importance to us. But that has made it possible for us to collect quite a bit of data. And as we collect this data, what we are increasingly beginning to see is that there are products that can come off this that we can provide to businesses that run fleets or businesses that need to use that data to offer products. Data now is currency. The data that we collect will also be very important because it will help us understand how to serve the rider better. We will understand the rider's habits. We will be able to improve the product that we're offering the rider. We will also be able to understand how to grow the rider's business.
Fascinating. I'm familiar with the copper business model, financing of solar home systems in the first instance, and the Cocoa Networks business model, both born out of Kenya, I think, where you're speaking to us from. So I can see the parallels there with that type of business model, and I can see how you're in a position to scale relatively quickly. I'm just interested, is financing of e-mobility, is it relatively cheap compared to other asset finance? I'm thinking, is it cheaper to finance a fixed asset rather than a mobile asset, or are there some benefits from the fact that having secured an electric bike or motorbike, you've then got a means to earn an income or a trade with that bike? I wonder if you could shed some light for me. I'm just personally very curious.
So if you're asking whether it's cheap for the rider to access financing for the e-bikes, obviously we're in the early stages of the industry and there are a number of players. But the dynamics around the affordability of the bike are pegged, one, on the cost of the product, and two, the cost of the power itself. So when we look at the cost of the product, one of the critical things is to make sure that we have the right product for Africa. We know, for example, that e-mobility has grown, especially in the two-wheeler space in India. We also know that there is good traction in China for two-wheelers as well. What we've learned from those markets is that the right product for the market makes it that you then have the right cost, and then you can bring in a product that the rider is able to find attractive and be able to use and attract other players as well. Now, for that product to be attractive to the rider, a lot of riders prefer to buy the bike on credit. And we know already from the ICE bikes that are in the market that those frameworks for access to credit already exist. So it's not necessarily that we are coming with a novel concept, but we are coming with a concept that's already very known and appreciated in Africa. The issue of accessing credit in Africa is already known as a challenge, and the different credit models that are available to a particular consumer really depend on how well you know that consumer and how we profile that consumer. But it is good that as we enter this space, this is not just our problem. This is also an issue that a number of players in the industry are already beginning to solve. So I would say that it is possible to get our products at an affordable rate. And not only are they going to be affordable, but they will become increasingly affordable with time as many more players begin to come into the space, as many more riders begin to take up the product, and also as the product in itself becomes affordable. And why this analogy is important is when I borrow very much from the telecommunication. When we started with phones were quite a challenge. They were a challenge initially because the governments were levying a lot of taxes on the phones. and therefore the landed cost of the phone would be very expensive. Fast forward, it became obvious that phones were critical enablers for digital penetration and advancement. So incentives were given around the phones. There are also now incentives to start manufacturing phones locally. And the phone ecosystem now has quite a few players who have made it that they position very affordable phones for Africa because they can see there is a market. I believe that in terms of affordability and access to credit, the EV journey is following those same steps. And with time, give it about 5, 7, 10 years, it will be very prevalent that these products will be affordable, they'll be easy to use, they will be easy to buy and easy to maintain. So the building blocks have begun. Are there challenges? Yes, but with time, because there are so many references of how to do credit business in Africa, it will become sustainable and viable.
Thank you for those insights. You mentioned your partnerships with governments, and you've just referenced the importance of subsidies and incentives that were granted to the telecoms industry when governments were awake to the fact that this was a mechanism to promote communications and inclusion. Tell us which governments on the continent are the most progressive in working with your industry to address challenges associated with personal transportation and decarbonisation.
Again, I appreciate that question, one, because this is one area I believe that governments in Africa are really taking a very proactive approach. If you come off the back of COP28 that was recently held, in fact, in November last year, you will see that government delegations to Dubai were very large and very many. And most governments within Africa were represented. Now, if I look within the East Africa cluster, for example, you will find that in Kenya, Uganda, Rwanda, Tanzania, there is already an agenda to address the e-mobility space. Now, could it be improved? Can it continue to evolve? By all means. But that the governments are very receptive to these discussions is evident. That this issue of e-mobility is topical is evident. It is not only a private sector-led discussion. You can see from the incentives that were brought within Kenya for players who want to play in the EV space, fairly good, fairly attractive. The other thing also that they're beginning to recognize, this is one place where a number of countries in Africa are well positioned to take advantage of. They have renewable resources. They are able to attract the right customer. What needs to happen increasingly is that the governments shouldn't see it as something that they should do alone, and they don't. What they're very open to is that they do need to provide patient capital. They do need to provide the right tax incentives. They do need to provide the right infrastructure and framework to allow more and more players to come in so that there is healthy competition and there is also ability to scale because different players within the ecosystem will be present. Ultimately, what will make sense in Africa when it comes to the e-mobility space is to have localized solutions that are actually harnessed from the power of those particular geographies in which they operate. So currently now, awareness is there. Currently now, policies are there. Yes, there are varying level of incentives, but there is a push from very many governments across Africa to be able to really drive this agenda. If you ask me which government in particular is standing at the forefront, it's really difficult to say. What I can say for sure is that the level of awareness is very high. And if I was to give a pass mark, 70-75% all Ghana, whether it's Nigeria, whether it's Benin, whether it's Togo, South Africa, Algeria, they are all addressing an EV consideration or an e-mobility challenge in one way or other. So they recognize that this is a critical need. And what I like is that they're also very well aware of the economic benefits. They substitute imported fuel for renewable energy. Then they also get the benefit of being able to sell carbon credits. And this is something that can really begin to shift the needle for the African continent because that is a new industry, so to speak, that can really take off for the continent. What is important, however, for the governments to really drive is not to necessarily drive this only at an industrial level, but make sure that from an educational level, in other words, because the African continent is very youthful, that within our schools, people are very aware that there is a big opportunity for Africa to harness and to explore within this particular space. And this is not an opportunity for one one country. This is an opportunity for countries as they come together, because each country has different elements that will become critical enablers for this to scale. So I think if there's one thing that can really help now is to really mainstream it more in the younger people, because our continent is youthful. So they come out of school knowing that this is going to be a big area in future.
Can I ask you to elaborate on that point, particularly around collaboration between countries? Are you alluding to manufacturing of the vehicles on the continent and the contributions from different countries and different parts of the value chain?
That is very true. So one of the things that I follow closely is AFTA, the African Free Continental Trade Agreement. Africa needs to become an economic bloc that knows how to trade with itself. And so the minute we are clear as to what kind of manufacturing opportunities can actually start being placed across the various areas of the continent, it will become pivotal. Within East Africa, we know we have the East Africa community, but more importantly, when you look at AFTA, one of the things that it is really trying to address is this whole friction around cross-border trade, paying of tariffs, poor information about market opportunities, a lot of red tape. So we are seeing increasingly that as we begin to understand that the opportunities exist beyond just your country, then very soon as we begin to move into the manufacturing space, it will be very, very important for African countries to be able to do trade with each other. So I see manufacturing becoming inevitable and just a natural consideration as we look at this EV journey. And very soon we could see 2 or 3 critical manufacturing hubs for e-vehicles across the continent.
Yes, I'm excited to hear you say that. I was at the Mining Indaba in Cape Town recently, and there was a focus on the ambitions of the DRC and Zambia to produce battery precursors. And just on this very podcast a few weeks back, or a couple of episodes ago, we had the CEO of Koboloni Energy, who are looking to build a cobalt sulfate factory in Zambia. So like you, I'm very excited about the prospects that African nations can seize to transform economies into manufacturing hubs, born really from the abundant renewable energy potential that we have on the continent and the competitiveness with which goods can be produced in Africa. We've got a long way to go to realize that. In the headlines just in the last 10 days, there's been news of manufacturing companies in Kenya and in Nigeria determining to pull out of those markets. They're global manufacturers, so that presents more opportunities for domestic companies to occupy that space. But it is for now a quite tough environment for many manufacturers in different parts of the value chain. Wangeci, you've given us a bit of a picture of what you see as sort of transformed transportation landscape might look like in Africa. I wonder if you could paint a little bit more of a picture of that prosperous Africa that you see being transformed, amongst other things, from manufacturing and from much improved transportation on the continent.
Yes. So I really am very hopeful about Africa. And I know increasingly for Africa to succeed, the people living on the continent have to start owning the opportunities. A lot of the things that we are calling challenges today, when you look at other continents, those challenges have become critical opportunities and propellers of their industrialization, their modernization, their urbanization. So for me, what I'm very clear about as Africa begins to move forward, one of the things that they will have to do is to learn to trade with itself. There is a lot of fragmentation when it comes to understanding Africa. The 54 countries create a very complicated and make it look complicated, let me say. But when you take a different view to Africa, what you should increasingly start doing is looking at Africa more as one and trying to see how you connect the dots across the geographies. So a successful Africa for me, a more prosperous Africa will be one where there is increasing trade. And there are statistics that show today Africa from an intertrade perspective is only doing 14.4% of trade with itself. But should it advance this into the future, then increasingly the trade deficit within Africa will reduce significantly. And that will make Africa just naturally much more prosperous. It will also make the cost of doing business in Africa much more sustainable. When you start thinking about the things that will help this continent leapfrog, you begin to understand the importance of the supply chains. COVID was a very, very good example that showed us increasingly that supply chains will need to start changing. They will need to start being nearer to the places where a lot of the raw material is being sourced. So as that shift happens, and even in Africa, as it continues to happen, what you will find is that people will begin to connect the dots. And that is why Africa, to come in and play and really prosper, you need to approach it in the form of a partnership, in the form of collaboration, recognizing that you can do one thing and another player can do another thing. So that is the Africa that I see. And also the other very important thing that will happen that has already contributed significantly to a lot of progress in Africa is the digital penetration, digital advancement, digital revolution. What we now need to really drive within Africa, because the digital infrastructure is now really having a lot more investment. We are seeing a lot more players understanding how important it is for Africa to really bridge the digital divide, is to begin to also bring onto the continent the right digital skills. So yes, we can talk of manufacturing, but we now need to talk about manufacturing within the context of AI, so that people then manufacture for the future. We begin to see a different manufacturing profile that can change the way Africa is doing manufacturing now. So it may have come late into the game, or it may have had pockets of manufacturing here and there, but going forward, we will need to start seeing more cross-functionally what is needed to make this particular industry leapfrog and move forward. So a lot more digital skills will be there. We have a lot more young people. So as our education system continues to adapt and evolve, what will happen increasingly is that digital skills will play a very important part in reducing the cost of doing business in Africa, will play a very important part in ensuring market information is synthesized correctly, is understood, is correct, is as real time as possible, and very relevant to the business opportunity, to make it possible for people to understand how they respond to their market opportunities in a better way. So I am very hopeful. I think Africa will continue to grow. I think we will find that the agenda will also move a lot more to private sector-led initiatives, where people in the private sector will begin to be hungry to make things change within Africa, so that there is a push to see a much better Africa. We are beginning to see some very inspiring entrepreneurs across the continent who are beginning to do things that 10, 15 years ago would not have been done. But now they are beginning to really look at Africa from the point of, what do I do to make it possible for me to do business in Africa, and for people to learn from me how to do business in Africa? And those examples are there, and they are there in critical economies where we are beginning to see things changing and those economies beginning to grow. So a lot more of African entrepreneurs understanding the continent, understanding how to do business in Africa, that will become prevalent, that will become the norm. And we will see then a lot more role models and a lot more people not waiting to have the problem resolved, but actually taking the initiative to resolve the problem. I also see an Africa where there will be less aid and also less debt, because currently now those are the crippling considerations, because there's a lot more borrowing for government expenditure, but not really a lot of focus on capital expenditure, whether it be capital in the form of education, capital in the form of health, capital in the form of really good industry that will help the continent move forward. So there will be a shift, and there will be business leaders who begin to understand that it's no longer just about me looking at my country, but it's also about me understanding the regional dynamics, the fact that Africa is also increasingly being positioned as a continent where there's a lot more opportunity, and where there will be certain countries within the continent that will become beacons that drive change across the continent.
Well, thank you for that picture you've painted, Wangeci. That was fantastic to hear. It's very clear that you're not just adapting to the continent and adapting your business model at SPIRO to the future needs of the continent, but you're increasingly shaping the future of the continent. And you see quite clearly those interdependencies between trade, digitalization, the energy transition, education, to mention those that you just referred. Really great to hear someone like you, with the experience that you have, set out a future state in the way that you have. So thank you for that. It's been a pleasure to speak to you today, and thank you for your time. Thank you, Wangeci.
Thank you so much, Marcus. Thank you. It was a pleasure to speak with you too.
Thank Thank you for tuning into a Voices of Africa podcast this week. Voices of Africa is a forum where Africa's leading experts weigh in on cross-sectional topics affecting the continent. Experts share their views on how we can unlock greater value that will benefit industry, government, and communities. For more of our insights, visit our website or subscribe to our weekly newsletter, Views on Africa, in the description.